Welcome to Goobertown Hobbies. My name is Brent. Today, we're going to use these Army Painter speed paints for their intended purpose. No real skill, no real plan. We're just going to put paint on a bunch of minis, see how they turn out, and see if we learn anything. Of course, the big question is whether or not this style of painting is something that you'd ever actually want to do. In a previous video, I made a whole bunch of monochrome test models to check out these colors and see how they looked over different base coats. As I mentioned in that video, Army Painter sent me a sample of Speedpaint ahead of release, but I'm under no obligations. Towards the end of that video, I started in on actually trying to paint some minis with multiple colors. I used a smaller brush to try to put paint where I wanted it without getting it anywhere else. A few turned out pretty cool, and a few didn't. Let's get a bigger sample of painted models and see how it goes. I've been playing in a D&D game, and our characters have visited some taverns in the city of Waterdeep. Check out the 20-Sided Realms podcast. Anyway, what I have here is a bunch of background NPC characters. These are going to populate the streets and taverns, but not necessarily interact with the players. I think speed painting these to table-ready standard is absolutely the way to go. I primed them black, and then used a makeup brush to dry brush all over with white. This pre-establishes shadows and highlights before the next step where I'm gonna start adding the translucent colored speed paints. I did one pass with a big makeup brush, and then I switched to a small makeup brush to make sure that each part of the model got at least a little bit of white. Here they are in black and white. In other circumstances, I might have used my airbrush to give these a zenithal prime of white on top of black, but I think the dry brush technique looks really cool, and you don't need any special gear to do it. I started with Crusader skin tone. I gave that to most of the humans, dwarves, and halflings. For variety, I mixed in a bit of brown for some of the characters, and a bit of pallid bone for others. Of course, when I got to the tieflings, kobolds, and dragonborn, I could really go wild with the skin colors. I had some half-baked strategies for reducing errors. Old painting wisdom says to paint skin tones first, because they're often the hardest areas to reach with your brush. I also thought about trying to paint lighter colors early on to minimize the impact of early mistakes, but I'm not so sure that any of that really matters. The challenge is that all of these paints are translucent, so making errors early in the paint job isn't that much better than making errors later on. I decided to paint reasonably fast, be reasonably careful, and fight the urge to ever go back and correct anything with white paint. So here's my strategy. I'm painting all 23 of these minis at once. Sorta like batch painting, except of course all of these minis are different. I'm going through the line of speed paints one at a time. I'm putting a few drops on my palette, and then making a snap decision for each character about whether that color belongs somewhere on them or not. I'm trying to embrace the speed paint. I want these background characters to look good, but then again, Waterdeep is a big city. Some folks know how to dress well, and some folks don't. Some people look cool, and some people don't. All of these models were printed from my STL collection for the specific purpose of being filler characters in a fantastical city. Some of them are armed, and some of them are casting spells, but they're all pretty much out of combat. Just a wacky group of figures that I can use to populate Waterdeep. Many of these characters come from the Lost Dragons and Lost Adventures Kickstarters that were run by Danny at 3D Printed Tabletop. Most of the rest are from the Titans of Adventure line that Titanforge does. So yep, color by color, I'm working through this pile of figures. For the really bright colors, I'm finding 4 or maybe 5 characters to put them on. Meanwhile, some of the drab colors like tan and brown are finding a place on almost every figure. I'm using a small brush. I'm trying to color inside the lines, and I'm trying not to make mistakes. I'm able to apply a thick wash in most places, and the speed paint is able to do what it does. But for some details, I needed to put less liquid on my brush and just kinda tint the undercoat that was already there. So this is gonna sound dumb, but I was actually surprised at how fast these models are getting painted. Each model is getting painted in less time than it would take me to base coat a figure with regular acrylic paint, and I'm not going to bother with any additional shading, highlighting, or details. Even base coats often take 2 or more thin coats of paint, and clearly this is only one coat. Speed paint flows off the brush faster than regular paint, and I don't need to worry about hiding brush strokes or anything like that. I was also happy to find that mistakes are way less important than I thought they were going to be. The most common type of mistake is a splotch of one color in the wrong spot. But by the time that wrong color is tinted the correct color, the result is a dark splotch that's generally not too noticeable. Especially with the black and white undercoat, there's enough contrast on these figures that mistakes are really hard to see. It's like the carpet in an elementary school or a hotel room, covered in stains that nobody will ever notice or care about. I saved gray and dark brown for last. These are great filler colors if nothing else seems to fit, and they're also decent options for belts and straps. That type of detail's a bit tricky, but with less liquid on the brush, I was able to make the speed paints work. Once I had taken a trip through all the colors, I looked at each mini one by one and filled in any white spots. I repainted the bases black and all of a sudden they were done. So here are some shots of the minis before varnish in case you want to check out the sheen. I'm definitely going to varnish these though, especially because I want to use them in games and they're going to see some wear and tear. A while back I made a video where I showed that varnish really does add a ton of protection for gaming minis. After my previous speed paint video, people asked for some durability tests. Now, if I take two minis and mash them together for a few minutes, we can see some chips appearing on the high points. This makes sense. The high points have the least paint, and they're going to experience the most friction. Another way to damage this paint job is to take some clear speed paint medium and mush it around. This is reactivating the previous layer, and the friction from the brush is wiping it off. If you want to use multiple layers of speed paint, you either need to varnish in between coats or be very gentle with the second and third layers. For the style of painting I've been doing here, each region only gets a single coat of speed paint, and I didn't run into any problems. If you want to add some details with acrylic paint, that works just fine. Also, the speed paint doesn't reactivate when you brush on a layer of varnish. I normally use airbrush or spray can varnish, but brush on can absolutely work here. In general, the speed paint is more delicate than multiple layers of acrylic paint, so I definitely do recommend a layer of varnish to seal in the paint job. I've got one more set of models here to paint. We'll use these to show off some sci-fi minis with a white base coat. These are some veil-touched Valkyrs from Ravage Star. This line of minis is a crowdfunding project from MiniWarGaming, and I have a few early prototypes. Again, these are painting fast. These minis have a lot of detail and a ton of filigree on the armor. Now, on similar models, I've put in the effort to paint that trim. This time though, I'm making the call that the armor is all one color. All of those shapes are an absolute playground for this wash, and we're getting some cool effects. Not painting the trim is a massive shortcut, but it kinda works. I'm liking the whole philosophy of speed paints, making choices fast, not worrying if multiple different objects all end up the same color, starting and finishing some minis in a single session, getting stuff done. This is a nice change of pace. I painted these Valkyrs fast, and a couple of them look decent. If you want to see these same minis painted with speed paints but painted well, I can highly recommend Dana Howl's video on the topic. Alright, glamour shots and more thoughts. This speed paint really is a good tool for getting models ready for the table. I should have timed this. I think I averaged like 20 or maybe 30 minutes per model, and that was just me plodding along and having fun. As expected, some of these look janky and some of these look pretty good. Like I said in the intro, I wasn't using any skill or strategy on these minis. I think this is a fair representation of what anyone can get from slapping these speed paints onto some models. Some of these minis look good enough that I might switch to regular paint and take them a few steps further. I'm probably going to at least add some eyes for a lot of these D&D models. The biggest difference between the models that look good and the models that don't look so good is the choice of colors. Ordinarily, color choice would be entirely my fault. But for these speed paints, it is pretty hard to guess what you'll end up with once the paint is on the model. The liquid speed paints are mostly dark and mysterious, and a lot depends on the base coat. For these D&D models with the black and white base coats, I had some models that turned out a bit dark and dull. But in my opinion, none of the models turned out too bright. I was mostly using Speedpaint straight from the bottle, but here and there I thinned one out with a bit of the Speedpaint medium. Thinned Speedpaints over black and white base coat look really good. The Speedpaint medium is good, but I'm dreading the day when I empty this tiny little, somewhat expensive bottle. Paint medium should come in much larger containers. Now let's take a look at the white undercoated Valkyrs. One of these turned out too bright, and one of these turned out too dark. These Speedpaints take some experience to know what to expect from them. Now, for the totally not Dark Angels paint scheme, I really like both of these. One of them is full strength Absolution Green, and one of them is a 50-50 dilution. I think they both work pretty well. I've been seeing some amazing paint jobs for these Ravage Star minis popping up on the internet. Don't be discouraged though, they can still look pretty cool with a fast paint job. And here we go. Here is a glorious tavern scene in the city of Waterdeep. This is an ode to tabletop standard minis. The paint jobs aren't outstanding, but they are painted. Painted minis are almost always better than unpainted minis. It took me about 3 evenings to paint 23 minis for this game, and they're done. They're serving their purpose. The tavern looks cool and alive, and now I can go paint something else. Remember to check out the 20-Sided Realms podcast, TSRP. And that's it for this time. Thank you all so much for watching.